Hey guys, it's Jackie. Welcome back to my channel to, I think, what will be the penultimate installment of my deck collection. We're winding down at this point, although the next two videos have a pretty good decent chunk of decks, but winding down nevertheless. But this installment is going to be decks that are inspired by literature and pop culture. Now, that comes with an addendum, right? Because in previous installments of this collection series, I've, done a lot of my fairy tale decks, which obviously several of those, things like the Duloc Tarot and the Rackham Tarot and the John Bower Tarot and a number of others, those are also what I would consider to be, literature and visual culture decks, right? Part of the appeal of them is the fact that they are children's storybook illustrations. But I wanted to give fairy tale decks their kind of own category. I also wanted to give my pop culture decks that are horror themed or kind of darker their own installment, which will be the last installment of this collection coming up next. So for this installment, I'm looking at decks inspired by literature and visual art and culture, pop art, things like that, film and television. I wanted this to be a kind of more general literature, general pop culture collection. So, for example, one of my absolute favorite oracles, the oracle I use probably more than any other, which is the Literary Witches Oracle. So this is, of course, a literature-themed deck that operates around this really fantastic conceit of having a lot of different, very influential women from the world of literature, the world of letters, I was about to say, like a pretentious academic, but the world of literature, and calling them witches, right? That they weave a kind of witchcraft with the power of their words. And it's a really stunning oracle deck that does have a quite lovely tie-in book that I also quite enjoy by Tasia Kaya, excuse me if I said that wrong, and illustrated by Katie Horan, who, again, they did the deck together, and it is a stunningly beautiful deck. It's a stunningly beautiful book. It's definitely a very interesting art book to pick up if you are interested in the lives of authors, and especially the lives of women in literature and their contributions to literature, because this deck and book kind of span they're very global, and they're spanning millennia worth of history. So we have people, like everyone from Sappho to Toni Morrison in here, right? So it's literally covering thousands of years of literary history. And again, it has a very global bent, which I really appreciate in any kind of literature deck. So I'm gonna go ahead, and I have so many cards in hand. So the deck itself comes in, again, this very sturdy box, which I quite love. It's one of my favorite display pieces to keep on the shelf just because the box itself is stunning. Again, Katie Horan's artwork in this deck is so beautiful. Does come with a small paperback little white book that is in full color. To kind of explain to you how the deck is broken up, which we have two categories of cards here. We have the witches, who are these author cards. So people like Virginia Woolf, Gertrude Stein, Sappho, Mary Shelley, etc. So these are cards that are, again, depicting an individual author, talking about, again, there's a keyword here to indicate what the deck creators thought this author best represented, or what energy that author is best channeling, and then a little bit about their biography, which, again, if you pick up this book, goes further into biographies. You don't have to have this book. Again, this is a beautiful coffee table book and a great piece to have as a companion for this deck. But all of these authors, you can Wikipedia them. They all have incredible lives. So again, there's a little bit about their lives, about, it has keywords, and about, again, what kind of interpretations that we can make with these cards. So Audre Lorde, for example, is the Justice card, and she can represent fighting for yourself, fighting for your values, fighting for your community, and things such as that. The second category of card is the Witches materials. And so these are much more traditional kind of pictorial oracle cards, like apple, bees, cat, chicken, and each of these also comes with a number of keywords in the guidebook to help you create an interpretation, although again, you're always free to, you know, let your intuition kind of guide you. And usually when I use this deck, I'm going to put you right there. What I will do is, let me pull out the deck. Here are our backs, which I think are so wonderful. They have this beautifully little, this little like gothic hand reaching for a book on the back. I just think that these card backs are so beautiful. But usually what I will do when I use this deck, if I'm using the deck exclusively on its own, which I often do, will be to keep the Witches and Witches Materials cards separate and shuffle them separately, and then I will pull, let's see from the top, Maria Sabina. So I will pull a card from the top just to kind of get a sense of, depending on what question I'm asking, you know, whose energy I'm channeling, whose energy I want to channel, and then I will pull 3 of the Witches Materials cards to kind of create different spreads. So, and again, you can mix and match however you want to do this, but that's just the way I usually do it. I'll pull 1 witch and then 3 Witches Materials to do a reading. And this is just, it's one of my favorite decks. I think that this deck is so stunning. It's so thoughtful and well thought out. And again, a really great way to celebrate a lot of very important female voices in the history of literature. So this next deck is kind of an interesting one. It was one that I wasn't quite sure where to place within my collection, but I ended up putting it here within my literature and pop culture decks, just because this deck for me represents a kind of literary aesthetic or a visual culture aesthetic. This is the tarot of, I believe it's the Manuscript of Initiation. From it's an indie deck from a user. I always get the name goofed. It's DarkSynevyrStore, I believe. Their Etsy shop is actually on hiatus right now because he's filling back orders. COVID has significantly slowed down shipping from his shop. He's based out of the Ukraine. Something I should mention, however, which people have complained about a lot with this deck, before I get into it, is this card stock is like paper thin. So a lot of folks are displeased with that because it's otherwise such a beautiful deck. It is gilded and the art is really stunning, but paper thin cardstock, which now, mind you, this is something that the artist may have since updated, because I believe before the shop went on hiatus, the price of this deck went up a little bit, but you'll have to check reviews. But anyway, this is the Manuscript of Initiation, and like I said, this represents to me a very interesting kind of literary aesthetic, a visual culture aesthetic. It's an aesthetic of medieval marginalia and illuminated manuscripts, and I just thought that this was such an interesting take on the tarot. So here's our King of Swords, for example, and so as you move through this deck, it's a kind of collage deck made up of different pieces of medieval marginalia being, you know, the things that we'll find kind of doodled or scrawled in the margins of a book. And if you look at a lot of medieval manuscripts, you sometimes find these very wonderful beasts and monsters and fair maidens, and sometimes like kind of curious pornographic images and a number of other things that are just kind of scribbled in the margins. And so I quite enjoy marginalia from an academic perspective. And so it's borrowing pieces of marginalia and pieces of iconography from an illuminated manuscript, which illuminated manuscripts, of course, books prior to the invention of the printing press were all done by hand and were prohibitively expensive. And so an illuminated manuscript, often again done by hand, would include these gorgeous, sumptuous, elaborate illustrations and calligraphy often. And so books that you see from, you know, the 12th, 13th, 14th century often come with what we would consider this kind of, you know, this iconographic, very prototypical medieval style of illustration. And I just thought that this deck was quite interesting because, again, I think this is such a smart use of collage, so that like something like the High Priestess, we're getting all of these different pieces of iconography of things that could represent the High Priestess taken from marginalia and from illuminated manuscripts. And I really just wanted to have this deck. I just think that it's so interesting and lovely. We have our Empress, Knight of Coins. So it's a really fun idea. I love this Death card. My favorite card in this deck is the Devil. There's the Tower upside down. That's interesting. But anyway, I was going to say that my favorite card in this deck is the Devil. Once again, I don't know why the Devil is so often my favorite card in a deck. I just think there's a lot of interesting things you can do with him visually, I suppose. But if you're interested in medieval literature or medieval visual art, I do highly recommend this deck. Just again, be mindful of the fact that the cardstock... it's not very good. Again, like I said, you know, before you commit to it, be sure to check out reviews of it on his shop once his shop comes back up, because I do know, again, before the shop went on hiatus, like, this deck got a new box, and so the cardstock might have been upgraded. So, you know, don't take my word for it, you know, do your research from people who purchased this more recently, because I bought this deck at the end of last year. So this next one in my collection is also one that I would consider to be a kind of literary or visual art aesthetic deck. This is the Steampunk Tarot, illustrated by Ali Fell. It's a Barbara Moore deck, as you can see. And this was actually a deck that was given to me by my friend Anna. It was a friend from graduate school. And it's quite special in that this is the first deck I was given as an adult. My very, very first decks, again, came from my mother when I was a very small child, but this was the first deck that was given to me by a friend as an adult, and it's the deck that kind of, again, entered into my hands as an adult deck and kind of re-sparked my interest in tarot. So it's a really kind of precious object. Anna is in my subscribers, so if you're out there watching, thank you. I still love this deck, and I use this deck all the time. It is quite a fun deck. Comes with a very, very hefty guidebook, which is a pretty fabulous guidebook. Again, one of the first books I read on tarot, technically. And it does a really good job of explaining everything that you need to know about the Rider-Waite-Smith system. And again, I'm quite fond of steampunk aesthetics. Steampunk aesthetic, which I have the feeling perhaps you as a person existing on the internet will know what steampunk is steampunk is this speculative aesthetic that combines Victorian aesthetic with this kind of sci-fi aesthetic. And it's a sci-fi aesthetic that is being powered literally by steam, hence steampunk. So we have steam-powered technologies present here. So things like, you know, zeppelins and steamboats and a number of other different things. And like sometimes these like really wild like spacecraft being powered by steam. And it's, again, it's this very kind of speculative aesthetic that like is interested in what if there was an alternative way of looking at the technological revolutions of the Victorian period. Like, what if the Victorians could have had, you know, these kind of sci-fi like airships that were powered by steam. And it's a really, really popular aesthetic that people become very, very enamored with. It's something that I find kind of interesting as someone who studies Victorian literature and is quite interested in neo-Victorian literature. So how Victorian aesthetics make their way into the present, how we are still so preoccupied with the Victorian period. So this was a deck I was really happy to get my hands on. And again, Anna knows that I'm 19th century literature garbage, so that's why she got me this one. Yeah, we see this very kind of cool steam-powered monster for the Devil. So this is a really fun deck. Again, easy to shuffle. It's a Barbara Moore deck, so it's really great. Excellent starter deck. Barbara Moore's decks are usually excellent starter decks if you want something, you know, beyond just the very traditional Rider-Waite-Smith. If you want something a little bit more themed and fun, then I highly recommend all of Moore's decks, really. But if you like 19th century literature like I do, and you like speculative fiction like I do, then I think the Steampunk Tarot is definitely a great starter deck. It's a great deck to just have in your collection, definitely. Speaking of steampunk, so this next deck is the Shadowhunters Tarot, which is based on, oh gosh, that universe has gotten so big and so out of control. So it's basically on what is loosely known as the Shadowhunters saga, which includes a number of different YA series by the author Cassandra Clare. So that includes The Mortal Instruments, The Infernal Devices, The Dark Artifices, a bunch of tie-in novels. Like, Cassandra Clare is nothing if not prolific. So this is kind of an interesting deck for me. This is available through Topatico. It does come with this really cute black velvet bag that has a rune stitched on it, which I quite liked as a detail. And this is an interesting deck for me because, okay, here's the thing. So I study and I teach young adult literature, and I talk about young adult literature all the time. I am not the hugest fan of Cassandra Clare. However, I really, really like her characters. I like these characters a lot more than I like her prose, for example. And I have a lot of very complicated feelings about Cassie Clare because I came of age at the height of the Harry Potter fandom, and so I have complex feelings about Cassie Clare as an author. However, I really do respect and adore her world building, and I really, really like her characters. And so I thought that a tarot deck made up of her characters, just it was too attractive to me to kind of pass up. So this is a tarot deck that is, again, if you flip through it, a character deck, that every card represents a different character from either the mortal instruments, the infernal devices, and I think I'm trying to remember if there are any characters from the dark artifices or if this was too early. I'm just going to go with the mortal instruments and the infernal devices for now. So for example, we have our magician is the warlock, and it's Magnus Bane, who is, oh, my son. Like, there's some cards in here which are, again, the reason why I really wanted to have this deck. Julian Blackthorne as the artist. So there are a couple changes, as you can see through some like the artist, the silent brother for the Hierophant. I love this Lovers card. So the Lovers card is reversible. We have Jason Clary, who I don't care about very much, I'm going to be honest. One of the reasons why I don't love those books. And then Magnus and Alec on the other side, who I care about far too much, honestly, more than is good for me. I quite love Malik, but I really, really like the design of this card. I love that it's reversible. I think that's really fun. And so just as you flip through this deck, you'll notice that, again, there are several changes. The Angel, the Genius, the Wheel of Fortune, or the Destined, which I think makes this deck kind of fun, kind of interesting. Certainly a great deck for fans of the series. This was the card that I had to have this deck. Let me get it back in focus, which is Isabel and Alec Lightwood as the soldiers, and they're here standing in for the tower, and you can see, again, the Institute being hit by lightning in the background. And I loved the Lightwood siblings as the tower, right? That things like Alec coming out of the closet is such, a major revelation that literally shakes the foundations of the Institute to the ground, that I just thought this was such a brilliant choice for the tower. So my Lightwood fangirl instincts, I had to get this deck. And again, it's pretty affordable. It's on Topatico, and the quality of the deck is really, really extraordinary. There are a couple extra cards in this deck, the Creator and the Scientist, for example, and just, yeah, it's a gorgeous book. I'm pretty positive, too, if I'm not mistaken, also on Topatico, there is a guidebook, like a guidebook to Shadowhunters through history, which is a tie-in in and of itself, that you don't have to have the tarot deck to use that. It's just kind of like, like a tie-in meta text to go with the series. But it certainly would be very cute alongside this tarot deck. I unfortunately don't have that. I just have this deck, and I quite like it. Here's our backs. So this is, it's a deck that I don't use nearly enough, I feel. It's one of those just very kind of like geeky aesthetic purchases. It's like, did you need this? Probably not. Are you happy to have it? Yeah, I am. I really am. It's a really nice deck. Again, if you're someone who's seriously trying to learn tarot, maybe not the best starter deck, just because of the amount of changes that this makes from both the RWS and the Marseille traditions. However, if you're a fan of the series who's just interested in having the deck for that purposes, you'll be fine. And if you're, again, an intermediate tarot reader, you should be fine with it, I would imagine. So that is the Shadowhunters Tarot, illustrated by Cassandra Jean. I almost forgot to mention because Cassandra Jean, Cassandra Clare, but illustrated by Cassandra Jean, and the illustrations are quite sweet, and I do really enjoy them. All right, so this next deck is actually one that pleasantly surprised me. And I know that that's kind of a common refrain on TarotTube, but genuinely, this deck ended up being so much nicer and more thoughtful than I thought it was going to be. This is the Game of Thrones Tarot with deck and guidebook. It has the cutest guidebook. I really love this little, like, medieval hardback book that it comes with. It's super, super cute and not in full color, just has, again, just a very quick explanation for our keywords, our characters, explanations of why the deck authors made the choices that they made. And it's using iconography from the television show, obviously. I'm saying that because I'm someone who is a bigger fan of the A Song of Ice and Fire novels than I am of the TV show, but I can appreciate good cinematography, and so I think this is actually a very pretty deck, and it has a number of very, very interesting tarot spreads in here based on the different religions in Westeros. So we have a spread for the old gods, a spread for the seven, which I think is really smart and cute. And this deck, again, I said it surprised me because this deck is so much more thoughtful and well put together than you might expect from a Game of Thrones tarot, right? I think that it would have been very easy for this deck to be just kind of, I don't know, a cheap cash grab. Again, it's a really affordable deck, so it is very, very mass market. And again, it was at a point when there was just so much merchandise for Game of Thrones. You could get Game of Thrones coasters, I mean, like pens, magnets, hats, beer koozies. It's just like, all right, we get it. So I think it would have been very easy for the Game of Thrones tarot to be a pretty easy cash grab. But actually, legitimately, this deck is so well, again, thought out and well put together. And a lot of the choices that are being made are, again, they're very conscious of the iconography of tarot. Like, clearly, our author knows a lot about tarot when putting this deck together, and a lot of the choices aren't even immediately obvious. You have to really sit and think with this deck for a while, which makes me really, really appreciate it, because some of these choices are, I think, very smart and very interesting. But it is a really gorgeous deck. Again, it has these great backs, which are these reversible, this kind of reversible sketchy image of the Iron Throne. And the cards are, again, they're photorealistic illustration, but they have this kind of sketchy parchment-like quality to them that keeps them firmly in the realm of illustration. So I quite enjoy that about it. And just, again, some of these choices are so great. We have the Tower, which makes so much sense. Seven of Swords. I'm especially looking for my majors. The King of Spears, Ace of Cups. Ace of Spears is House Martell. And it, like this one is so smart. I love this card. So the Strength card is Brienne of Tarth with Jaime's sword. So right, we get our maiden and our lion, and I think that this is such an interesting play on the usual iconography of tarot, right? That we have the maiden taming a lion in the Strength card, and I think that there's no better representation of that in Game of Thrones than Brienne literally taming Jaime Lannister. And so we have, like, there's just a lot of complicated things going on here. We have the meta text of the fact that, you know, Jaime has to some degree been tamed by Brienne, has fallen in love with Brienne. We have, you know, strength in as far as we literally have his sword in her hand, right? That he's giving her his strength in that sense, literally weaponizing her in that way so that she'll be able to better defend herself. And there's so much going on. That's what I'm saying. Like, these cards are actually very thoughtful and make a lot of sense for the characters. Again, they're not perfect. There's some choices that I was kind of like, okay. I love this one as the Hierophant. We stan, honestly. Lord Varys, he's my favorite. But this is really such a gorgeous deck that, again, makes a lot of very thoughtful choices. Yeah, like this one, I just think this is such a boring choice for Page of Swords. Like, such a boring choice. But a lot of these other choices, like, again, yeah, Olenna is Queen of Coins. And again, like, there's a lot of really great ones. Like, one that I see people talk about a lot is House Bolton's. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, I finally found it. So this is one of my favorite cards in the deck because it's the Hanged Man, and it's the banner of House Bolton, which a lot of people were like, well, that's kind of a dull choice. But if we read this card and understand that this is Theon Greyjoy, I think that is such an ingenious choice for the Hanged Man. Like, Theon is so the Hanged Man. And Theon doesn't appear anywhere else in the deck, so I choose to interpret that, like, the Hanged Man here, like the man being skinned in the Bolton banner, is Theon Greyjoy. And Theon Greyjoy is one of my favorite characters from that series because I think he's very dynamic and interesting. And anyway, I really, really like this deck a lot. this is also a deck that is so affordable. It's gotten down to like 12 bucks on Amazon, and it's honestly worth it all day long. If you're a fan of the series, I highly recommend picking this up. If you're a fan of the books too, I highly recommend picking it up because it genuinely is a much more thoughtful deck than I anticipated. And so I was really pleasantly surprised with the quality of the deck. Again, it has this beautiful display box, but also how much thought and effort actually went into the assignments in this deck, definitely. So like a deck I use all the time. Like, I thought this would be, again, a kind of showpiece. Like, I would put it on my Game of Thrones shelf as someone who loves tarot and quite enjoys the Song of Ice and Fire, and I wouldn't reach for it very much, but I actually reach for this deck quite a lot more than I thought I would. It's a very functional deck, so I highly recommend this one. This next deck is one that I've actually had a chance to show off on my channel quite recently because I just got this deck not that long ago. This is the Movie Tarot, A Hero's Journey in 78 Cards, illustrated by Natalie Foss, and this artwork is so gorgeous to me. Like I said in my full flip through video, I quite like pop culture decks. As you can see, it's why, again, I have what are basically 2 different installments of this collection series just pop culture decks, but there's not a lot of kind of very general movie and television tarots that I like. However, Natalie Foss's artwork is so I don't know, it's so unique and lovely and interesting that I really wanted to go ahead and pick this one up. Here's our backs, which are not reversible. And it's such a gorgeous deck. Again, it comes with a couple of addendums, which I'll get to as I get to them, but it's such a beautiful deck. All of the major arcana and the courts and the aces depict different characters from the history of cinema. Again, there's some notable omissions that people pointed out in the comments on my review video, like the fact that Star Wars is missing here is so strange to me in A Hero's Journey deck, because again, the Movie Tarot, the basic premise is that if you're not familiar with the Hero's Journey, this is a literary theory, I shouldn't say literary theory, I should say cultural media studies theory put forth by scholar Joseph Campbell that argues that, you know, all stories, but especially film, follow a specific path, what is known as the hero's journey, and it always involves our protagonist encountering along the way all of these different like Jungian archetypes and these very, very kind of important milestones in his development, and that structurally every story is the same, right? That there's a kind of there's a mythopoetic quality to film and how film narrative is put together. And one of the most famous examples that is often cited when talking about the hero's journey is Star Wars, and so it's strange to me not to have a Star Wars card in this deck. The other thing that's really notable about this deck, which I know a lot of people are not happy about, myself included, is that it is a pip deck. So again, the major arcana and the courts and the aces are all characters from film, but the minors are just pips, which is pretty disappointing. There's Tyler Durden. Yeah, see, there are wands. Forrest Gump is the Fool. Our cups, our coins, which I do find, again, the pips very pretty, like I said in my review video, but it is a little disappointing when you have the entirety of the history of cinema at your disposal to just have pips. It was such a drag. Gordon Gekko, Allie from The Notebook. So again, this is a really beautiful deck, great quality. There's Katniss Everdeen. Covers a lot of different genres of film. It's still a very kind of like film canon deck, so don't expect to see a lot of really outlandish choices in here the way that you will with some like indie movie decks. Like a lot of these are very mainstream films for the most part. I love Brokeback Mountain as the lovers, but it is really a gorgeous deck just by virtue of Natalie Foss's art. But again, the minors are pips, which is a little disappointing, but if you don't mind having a pip deck, then I highly recommend this one. It's also affordable and excellent quality, and just, I really love, it's her use of color, I think, is just so stunning. So, a movie tarot that I'm really, really happy to have in my collection, as I didn't really have a kind of general history of cinema deck in my collection. So, I think that the movie tarot is a really great choice, and this box is so beautiful. So beautiful. Oh, I forgot, because, again, I just reviewed this deck. It does come with a little white book that is just a kind of little stitched together pamphlet that is in full color, gives explanations for, you know, who these characters in the films are. Like I said in my review video, though, it forgot to tell you who the aces are. So, so that might be bad. If you don't know who they are and you have this deck, go check out my review video, because I do know who all 4 of them are. But yeah, they forgot to put those in the guidebook. So that was a little bit of an oops. But otherwise, it is a really, really beautiful deck. All right, this next one is kind of, this is kind of a strange one, I feel. I'm getting such a bad glare on these. There we go. This is the William Blake Tarot of the Creative Imagination, Revised Edition. There's our beautiful, again, interesting backs, not reversible. I don't really like reading reversals with this deck, so that's totally fine. So this is a deck that uses retrofitted art from Romantic poet, scholar, and painter William Blake, who was, how do I put this nicely? A very interesting man, very ahead of his time, even amongst the Romantics, I would argue, very, very ahead of his time. And again, a very fine poet. I have a copy of his book here, Songs of Innocence and Inexperience, which is his most famous poetic work, perhaps, which was a book of children's verse about innocence, experience. Again, these very kind of romantic with a capital R notions about, you know, the innocence of children and how children are corrupted by experience and how children need to be protected. And those are very, very progressive modern ideas in the early 19th century and late 18th century when Blake was living and working. And again, in addition to being a poet, though, he also was a very fine painter, painted with watercolors, illustrated his own work, because Songs of Innocence and Experience comes with a full set of absolutely gorgeous watercolor work. So this is a deck that is just celebrating his art and his philosophy about art. Some of the images are directly taken from paintings of his, and some of them are, again, retrofitted or collaged in, where they're being kind of taking disparate elements from Blake's work and collaging them to create an image that is reminiscent of a tarot card. And I really wanted to have this deck. It was not easy to find. You can still find this through, I got mine through a third-party seller on Amazon. However, if I'm not mistaken, the deck creator, Ed Buryn, still sells it on his website, I believe. And it's very esoteric. It's very much a celebration of human imagination and creativity. So again, the deck is literally called the Tarot of the Creative Imagination. And it does a very interesting thing where the suits here are different, that we have, instead of our 4 traditional suits in a tarot deck, they've been replaced with painting, science, music, and poetry. So 4 different means by which human creativity and imagination are expressed. And very roughly, painting stands in for the wands, science for the swords, music for the cups, and poetry for the coins. Or maybe I've gotten that. Did I get it confused? I might have gotten it confused. Give me a moment. As you can tell by looking at it, again, a lot of even the major arcana are labeled differently. So our magician is just magic, and we have forgiveness. So this is it's a deck that's doing very interesting things and taking a lot of wild leaps and bounds. But I quite like this deck. I think that it's really unique. And as someone who quite enjoys Blake's artwork, I enjoy his artwork more than I enjoy his poetry, to be totally honest. Again, he's a very fine poet, but there's something about his artwork that is so, I don't, just dreamlike, surreal, so ahead of its time. Again, he really was ahead of his time, and I say that as, again, I'm judging that based on even the other Romantic poets, capital R Romantic poets, who were all very, you know, progressive, visionary, social pariahs, very, very strange group of folk, I have to say. But William Blake kind of takes the cake as by far the strangest, and spoke quite candidly at times about how a lot of his work he felt were visions from God, that he spoke to angels and to God. And I don't know, he's just a very interesting historical figure who I highly recommend checking out his artwork if you're not familiar with it. I think that the most popular reiteration of Blake's artwork in mass media as of late is his paintings of the Great Red Dragon make an appearance in Silence of the Lambs, not Silence of the Lambs, the first, Red Dragon, Hannibal, the TV show, NBC's Hannibal. Thomas Harris does very interesting work with Blake's artwork in several of his novels. And so if you're familiar with the Hannibal Lecter series, or you're familiar with, again, Red Dragon or NBC's Hannibal, you will know of Blake's paintings, that the serial killer Francis Dollarhide in Red Dragon has Blake's artwork tattooed on his back. So I think that's pretty interesting. But anyway, so this is a very unique deck. Again, a little trickier to track down. But if you're looking for a kind of unusual deck, or a deck that is very interested in celebrating human ingenuity and imagination and art itself, then I highly recommend this deck. If you're someone who loves Blake, I think you will get a kick out of this deck, absolutely. And I love all of these things, so I really get a kick out of this deck. I think it's really, really gorgeous. Okay, the last deck that I want to show you guys for this installment is actually an oracle deck. And this is an oracle deck I picked up in February while I was in Los Angeles, my last big trip before the COVID lockdown. And this is the Art Oracles deck, Creative and Life Inspiration from the Great Artists. And it's produced by the same company, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Lawrence King Publishing, who makes the movie Tarot. And I mean, absolutely gorgeous box. And this is a very fun oracle deck. I don't love these backs, if I'm being totally honest, though. I think that they're so, I don't know. This looks like a college mascot jersey to me, or something, like, you know, like there's something about it that feels very like collegiate calligraphy on like a jersey for your college. But anyway, so this is a gorgeous oracle deck that is again, it's published by the same folks who made the movie Tarot, but it's the most similar to the Literary Witches Tarot, because each card in this deck is a different painter from the history of visual art. So we have like Gustav Klimt. And we get this beautiful artwork of our particular artist, and then we get some advice from the oracle. Again, some different token words and key phrases. And they have little, they have little icons next to them to kind of indicate, depending on what kind of reading you're performing, which piece of advice to take. So here we have, this is life. Every portrait is a self-portrait. Our pencil is work. If no group will have you, start your own. And the eye is inspiration. Like gold, eroticism fluctuates with the times. So each of these kind of pieces of advice is obviously very much based on the biography and style of these particular artists. And it's just such a lovely deck. It really is. And a pretty, again, thorough deck in as far as it's decently comprehensive of the history of art. A lot of different periods and traditions are covered here, and it's once again a very kind of global deck. There's Goya, Durr, Kahlo, George O'Keeffe, Gilbert and George. So I really like this deck. I picked it up in Los Angeles at Duck Soup and drove my mother and brother bananas, just doing readings in the car as we drove around Los Angeles. Jackson Pollock, Basquiat. So again, if you love visual art, if you love the history of painting and you want an interesting oracle, I highly recommend this one. It's so colorful and gorgeous and just fun, and again, pretty straightforward to use as an oracle deck, because it just literally has, like, not even key words, but key sentences and pieces of advice. There's Diane Arbus, Edvard Munch, Marinetti. So yeah, I mean, I think that this deck is just absolutely stunning. Leonardo da Vinci. So it's one that I quite like. I haven't really paired it yet with a tarot deck. It's one that I just kind of use on its own. I'm quite like the Literary Witches Oracle. I tend to use those decks by themselves, I think, maybe just because I'm interested enough in the biographies and of these people and the histories of their art traditions to just, that's all I really want to think about when I use them, or that's all the kind of information I want to draw on when I'm reading with them intuitively. I don't want to clutter things up too much, so I don't really read them alongside a tarot deck. This, like the movie Tarot, also comes with this little pamphlet, little stitched together pamphlet that has, again, full color illustrations, an explanation and kind of mini biography of each of these artists if you're not familiar with them or their work. So all in all, again, I really like this deck quite a lot. I use it and the Literary Witches Tarot, or Tarot Oracle, all the time. They're probably my most used oracles. Like I've said in previous installments of this video, I don't use oracles a ton, but these are the oracles I usually reach for the most because they can so easily be used by themselves for me. All right, so I also have here's the rub. So I also have quite a few pop culture decks that would qualify as horror or dark decks, shadow decks, that are explicitly based on popular culture, on films, television, animation. Like, I'm just totally cluttering up the screen at this point. But I want to wait until the next installment of the series to cover these because there's so many of them. I am a horror scholar by trade. That is my subspecialization more than any other subspecialization. That is that's what gets me geeked, is horror and the gothic. So I have quite a few dark decks, shadow decks, horror-based decks, etc. So the next installment of this series is going to just be my dark horror-themed decks, just in time for Halloween. So I'll see you over in that next video. And until then, this is Jackie, and take care.